My name is Harper Calloway, and I want to tell you about the exact second a glass broke in a stranger's hand 300 feet from where I was standing, and how that sound changed the rest of my life. I did not know the man holding it, not yet. I only knew that the string quartet had just finished a phrase, that the ballroom smelled like white peonies and imported champagne, and that somewhere behind me my father's voice was still ringing off the vaulted ceiling, calling me something I am not going to repeat yet, because you have not earned that part of the story. All I could see, when I turned, was the groom of the wedding I had come to sit quietly through, frozen mid-step with a shattered flute at his feet, staring at me like he had seen a ghost he owed his life to. If you have ever watched a room full of powerful people go completely silent at once, you know it is not really silence. It is 300 people deciding, in the same half-second, that whatever just happened matters more than anything they were about to say. If that has ever happened to you, tell me in the comments where you were standing when it did. And if you have ever been the person a room decided to look past, stay with me, because this one is for you. To understand why a tech billionaire's hands were shaking over a broken champagne flute, you have to go back further than that ballroom. You have to go back to a kitchen table in a house with too many rooms and not enough warmth, and to a 6-year-old boy named Miles asking his mother a question she did not have a good answer for. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Heavy cream cardstock, gold foil, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than I used to make in a day doing range safety work. My half-sister Vivian was marrying a man named Grant Ashford, and the wedding was going to be held at a private estate above Newport Beach, the kind of place where the hedges are trimmed by hand and the ocean looks like it was hired for the occasion. I sat at my kitchen table with that envelope for a long time before I opened it. My son was doing homework across from me, 6 years old, missing a front tooth, entirely unaware that the woman across the table from him had once knelt in dirt on the other side of the world with her hands inside a device built to kill her. I decided not to think about the last time I had seen my father in person, which had been at my grandmother's funeral, where he had introduced me to a cousin's new husband as, and I remember this exactly, my daughter who used to be in the service. Used to be, as if it were a phase, as if 10 years, a silver star, and a piece of shrapnel still living 2 inches from my spine were a phase. I almost did not go. But Miles had never met his Aunt Vivian properly, had never seen where half of his family came from, and some stubborn, tired part of me still believed that if I kept showing up quietly enough, kept being decent long enough, eventually the door my father had shut on me would open again on its own. I want to be honest with you about that belief, because it is the belief that got me into that ballroom in the first place, and it took me 34 years and one very expensive wedding to finally let it go. Before I tell you what happened in that dress and under those chandeliers, I need to give you a little of what came before. Because otherwise, this just sounds like a rich family being cruel to a poor relative at a party, and it is so much more than that. My father, Franklin Calloway, built a real estate empire out of almost nothing, and he is proud of that, and he has earned the right to be. What he never earned, and never quite forgave me for taking without his permission, was a life he did not control. I enlisted at 19 against his direct wishes. He told me, standing in the doorway of the house I grew up in, that I was throwing away opportunities other people would kill for, and that if I walked out that door in a uniform, I could stop expecting a seat at his table. I walked out that door anyway, trained as an explosive ordnance disposal officer, which is a polite way of saying I spent 10 years learning how to kneel 3 feet from something built to kill me and take it apart with my hands anyway. Because someone had to, and because I turned out to be very good at it. I do not say that to brag. I say it because it matters for what comes later, and because for years I was the only person who knew it. I came home from my last deployment pregnant, injured, and quietly discharged, and my family did not throw a parade. My mother had passed when I was in my 20s. My father's second wife, Diane, met me at a holiday dinner with a look that told me exactly where I ranked in the new order of the household, somewhere below the caterer and above nothing at all. Vivian was 17 then, golden and easy to love, the daughter who had never once disappointed anyone, and I watched my father's whole face change when she walked into a room, the way it never changed for me. I am not telling you this to make you hate my family before you have even met them properly. Some of what happened, I let happen. I want to own that, because the version of this story where I am simply a victim is not the true one. I let my father introduce me as a woman who used to be in the service. I let Diane seat me at tables with the caterer's cousins. I let 7 years pass without correcting a single misunderstanding about who I was or what I had done, because correcting it meant opening a door I had welded shut myself, and because some tired, proud, wounded part of me had decided it was easier to be underestimated than to be disbelieved. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes from choosing your battles for so long that you forget you are allowed to have any. My father's company had bet heavily on a stalled resort project 2 years before the wedding, the kind of setback he called restructuring, when a cousin let it slip. I didn't ask questions. Rich families restructure the way the rest of us clean out a junk drawer, loudly, then back to normal. I filed it away and kept driving. On the drive down to Newport Beach, Miles asked me from the back seat why his grandmother, meaning Diane, never said my whole name. I told him it was complicated, which is the answer adults give children when the true answer is too heavy for a car ride. He accepted it the way 6-year-olds accept most things, which is to say he let it go for exactly 4 minutes before asking if there would be a pool. There was a pool. There was also a small sealed folder in my glove compartment that I had not opened in over a year, containing paperwork for a disability trust the Department of Veterans Affairs had helped me set up after I was medically retired. My father had offered, back when I still trusted his offers, to serve as trustee. The payments went in, and he had signing authority to disperse them for my care while I got back on my feet with a newborn. I signed the paperwork in a hospital room I barely remember being in, half sedated, grateful for the help. I had not looked closely at a statement from that account in 3 years. I want you to remember that detail. It matters later, more than I understood that day. We arrived at the estate a little after 4 in the afternoon, and I will admit, walking miles up that drive, past a fountain that probably cost more than my car, some old and stubborn hope in me still wanted this to go well. I remember thinking, walking past that fountain, that a resort project, which had supposedly stalled 2 years earlier, had clearly found new money from somewhere, because nothing about that estate looked like a company that was still restructuring. It went the way these things always went with my family, which is to say quietly, at first. Diane greeted us at the reception table with a smile calibrated for photographs and introduced me to the woman checking names as family. No last name. No first name even. Just family. The way you would describe a piece of furniture that had come with the house. Miles, holding my hand, looked up at the place cards laid out in careful calligraphy and asked, loud enough for the woman at the table to hear, why mine did not have my whole name on it like everyone else's. I told him some cards are just made in a hurry. He did not believe me. 6-year-olds are better lie detectors than most judges I have testified in front of. There is a bracelet I need to mention here, because you will understand its importance later. And I promised myself I would give you the truth in order, the way it actually happened to me, not the way it makes the best trailer. Diane had sent it to my hotel room that morning with a note that said it would look lovely with my dress. It was a wide cuff silver, cool against my skin, and it sat directly over a scar on the inside of my left wrist, a scar shaped like a crescent moon, the kind of scar you only get one specific way. I put it on without thinking twice about it. I had covered that scar with sleeves and bracelets and long gloves for 7 years. It was reflex, not strategy. I mention it now because reflexes, it turns out, can change the whole shape of a night. The ceremony itself was lovely. In the detached way, these things are lovely when you are wanting your perform happiness for an audience of donors and business partners. Vivian looked radiant. My father walked her down the aisle with his chest out and his jaw set. The posture of a man who believes he built the day out of his own bare hands. And in a financial sense, that was not entirely wrong. Though not for the reasons he wanted anyone to believe. I watched the groom during the vows more than I meant to. Grant Ashford was tall, composed, the kind of calm that money alone does not buy, and something about the way he held his shoulders, weight balanced, hands still, eyes moving in slow, deliberate sweeps across a room instead of settling anywhere too long, snagged on something old and half buried in me. I told myself it was nothing. I have learned since not to trust myself when I tell myself that. At the cocktail hour, Miles and I stood near the edge of the terrace, out of the main current of the party, which is where my father generally preferred me to stand. A man in a dark suit, one of the groomsmen, caught my eye across the crowd, paused mid-conversation, and looked at me the particular way people who have served look at other people who have served. A recognition that has nothing to do with faces and everything to do with the way you carry your spine. I did not think much of it in the moment. I filed it away the way you file away a lot of small, strange things at a party where you are trying very hard to be invisible. Dinner was seated, formal, structured around a head table and a scatter of smaller ones. Miles and I were placed at table 14, near the kitchen doors, beside 2 of Diane's cousins who spent most of the meal discussing a boat. My father gave the welcome toast standing at the head table, champagne in hand, and somewhere in the middle of a long, warm story about Vivian's childhood. He found a way to work in a line about how his family had always known how to build something real, unlike some people who chase harder things and end up with nothing to show for it. He did not look at me when he said it. He did not have to. Every relative at that party who had spent the last 7 years hearing some version of that sentence knew exactly who it was for. I sat very still. I had gotten good at sitting still. Then something happened that I could not sit still through. A young cousin of Diane's, seated near enough to overhear, leaned toward my father with a champagne-loosened grin and asked, not unkindly, what exactly it was that I did for work these days, since nobody at the table seemed to know. My father set down his fork. I watched him decide, in real time, that this was an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. And I understood, a half-second too late, that I had let my guard down for one small mistake too long. Because I had actually started to relax at that table. He stood. He picked up the microphone that had been left near the head table for toasts. He said my name into it, full volume, in front of roughly 300 guests, and told them that his eldest daughter had spent her 20s throwing away every advantage he had ever given her. That she had come home from what he called her little adventure overseas with nothing to show for it but a fatherless child and a habit of living off government checks. And that if anyone wanted to know what happens when you choose stubbornness over family, they should look no further than the woman sitting quietly at table 14 like the help. He said it laughing, the way men like my father say the cruelest things, dressed up as a joke, so that anyone who objects looks like they cannot take one. 300 people turned to look at table 14. Miles, 6 years old, felt every one of those eyes land on his mother. And he did the thing 6-year-olds do when the ground shifts under them without warning. He started to cry, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, asking me in a small broken voice why everyone hated us. I have knelt beside live ordnance with my hands inside a device that could have taken both my arms and not felt my pulse move the way it moved in that ballroom, Hearing my own son ask me that question in front of everyone my father had ever wanted to impress. I did not stand up and defend myself. I did not raise my voice. I picked Miles up. I held him against my chest the way I had held him the night he was born. In a hospital room, 3 states away from anyone in that ballroom, and I began to walk him toward the terrace doors. Because whatever I owed my father after 34 years of trying to earn a seat at his table, I did not owe him my son's tears as entertainment for his guests. I made it 4 steps. That was when the sound came from the other side of the room, sharp and sudden over the low murmur of 300 stunned people, a champagne flute shattering against marble. I turned, the way anyone turns toward a sudden loud noise, and I saw the groom standing perfectly still at the edge of the head table, a broken glass at his feet. Staring across the room directly at me, with an expression I have only ever seen on the faces of people who have just recognized someone they thought they would never see again. That is where we started tonight, and now you know why. Let me take you back to the moment I understood why. Grant Ashford crossed that ballroom like the floor had personally offended him. He did not glance at his own bride. He did not glance at my father, still holding the microphone with the satisfied look of a man who believes he has just settled an old score. He walked straight to me, stopped close enough that I could see his hands were shaking, and said my name. Not my full name. My call sign. From another life. In another country. One that exactly 3 living human beings had ever used to my face. Steady hand. I have been trained to control my reactions under conditions most people cannot imagine. I did not control that one. I felt the floor tilt, the specific vertigo of the past reaching directly into the present and taking hold of your wrist. How do you know that name? I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Because that is a skill you learn kneeling in the dirt, not a skill you learn at dinner parties. He held up his right hand, and for a moment I thought he meant to shake mine, and then I understood he was showing me the inside of his wrist, where a thin, pale line ran in the exact shape of a memory I had spent 7 years trying not to touch. Mosul, he said, 7 years ago, a supply convoy that took the wrong turn into a lane that had been seeded overnight. I was the intelligence officer who got caught in the open when the second device went off. You crawled 40 meters on your hands as knees through ground that could have ended you at any step, and you got a tourniquet on my arm before I bled out in the dirt. And you carried half my weight for the last stretch because I could not stand on my own. His voice cracked on the last few words in a way I do not think he expected it to. I have spent 7 years trying to find the officer who did that, and every time I asked, I hit a dead end. Because the name in the after-action report and the name your family uses for you, at dinner tables apparently, are not the same amount of person. Behind him, I could see my father's face changing in slow, confused stages, the particular expression of a man watching a story he has told for years come apart in real time in front of an audience he cannot control. Grant reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small brass coin, worn smooth on one side, and set it flat on the linen tablecloth between us, instead of handing it to me. The way you set down something too important to risk dropping. I've carried this since the field hospital, he said. Whitfield had it engraved for me before I even knew your name. I want you to have it back. I did not pick it up. Not yet. There was too much happening in that room for my hands to be steady enough to hold something small and that heavy at the same time. I need to be honest here, because I promised you the version that isn't tidy. What I felt in that moment was not triumph. I have thought about that a lot since. I did not feel like I had won anything. I felt exposed, and grateful, and furious, all 3 at once, in a way that does not fit neatly into a single expression. So I am told my face did something complicated that a lot of people in that ballroom would later describe differently, depending on where they were standing. A man near the head table, dark suit, steady bearing, The same groomsman who had looked at me strangely during the cocktail hour stepped forward and said, quietly but clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear, that he had served alongside Grant in the same intelligence unit, that he remembered the after-action report from that convoy by heart because he had helped write it, and that the name on it, the real one, belonged to a Captain Harper Calloway. United States Army, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, recipient of the Silver Star for actions that day. His name was Colonel Marcus Whitfield, and he would turn out to matter a great deal more than a single sentence at a wedding, but that came later. My father set the microphone down on the head table like it had suddenly gotten heavy. I watched him look at me the way you look at something you have been assured for years is small, and discover it is not small at all. And I watched something calculating move behind his eyes even faster than the shock did. The specific look of a man doing quiet math about damage control before he has even finished feeling the damage. Diane appeared at his elbow within seconds, murmuring something about how the family had simply never wanted to make a fuss about my service, how we had always been so proud, so private about it. The kind of sentence built entirely out of the right words in the wrong order, designed to sound like humility and function like a cover story. Here is what mattered in that moment, with 300 people staring, and a groom holding a coin that meant more than any medal I owned. My father still believed he could manage this. He believed it the same easy way he had believed it for 7 years. That if he simply kept talking, kept smiling, kept controlling the room, the true shape of things would stay buried under the story he preferred. He gestured for the band to start playing again. He clapped Grant on the shoulder like they were sharing an inside joke and suggested loudly enough for the nearby tables that we all let the happy couple get back to their evening. For a moment, watching the band find its rhythm again, I almost believed he had done it, pulled the room back under his control one more time, the way he always had. For about 90 seconds, it almost worked. The band did start playing. A few tables did turn back to their conversations, the way rooms do when they are given permission to look away from something uncomfortable. Grant did not turn away. He asked quietly if we could speak somewhere with fewer ears, and I said yes, because whatever this was, it deserved more than a ballroom floor. We ended up on a stone terrace above the water, string lights strung overhead, the party's noise muffled behind glass doors. Miles had fallen asleep against my shoulder somewhere in the last 10 minutes, worn out the way children get worn out by big feelings they do not have words for yet, and I sat down on a low wall with him curled against me while Grant paced, still holding that coin he had not managed to give me yet. He told me the rest of it there, the parts the after-action report could not hold. He described the lane the way people who were actually there describe it, not the way it reads in a report. The mud walls close enough on both sides to touch. The heat that made the air over the road shimmer even at dusk. The sound of the second device going off somewhere behind him, and the world tipping sideways all at once. He remembered, he said, staring up at a strip of sky the exact color of a bruise, certain he was going to die in a country whose language he had spent 2 years learning and never once used to say goodbye to anyone. And then a voice had reached him, low even, entirely unhurried, telling him to keep his eyes open and his hand still, and he had done both, because something about that voice made obeying it feel like the only sane choice left in the world. He stopped pacing for a moment and looked out at the water before he went on. He had woken up in a field hospital, not knowing whose hands had saved his arm, only that they had been steady in a way nothing else in that valley had been. Then he told me how he had spent years quietly, in the margins of a very full life, trying to track down the officer from that convoy, and hitting the same wall every time. A woman who seemed to have simply stopped existing after her discharge paperwork was filed. And then he told me how, 3 weeks before his own wedding, doing what he called ordinary due diligence, The kind any responsible person does before merging a life and an estate with someone else's family. His financial team had flagged something strange in the Calloway family structure that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with what came next. I asked him what he meant. He hesitated in a way that told me, before he said a single word, that whatever came next was going to hurt more than my father's toast had. "There's an account," he said carefully. "A VA disability trust, under a name that matched your discharge paperwork. That's had a series of transfers out of it over the last 18 months. Structured, kept under reporting thresholds. Moving into an events and hospitality account tied to your father's company." He watched my face while he said it. The way you watch someone's face when you already suspect the news is going to knock something loose in them. My team flagged it because the pattern looked like something we've seen before in family businesses under cash pressure. I didn't know, until an hour ago, that the trust belonged to you. Some part of me expected to feel shock. What I actually felt was something colder and quieter, the specific, sick non-surprise of a suspicion you had buried so deep, you had convinced yourself it did not exist. I thought about a folder in my glove compartment I had not opened in over a year. I thought about a hospital room, half sedated, signing something my father had told me not to worry about. I thought about every year since when I had told myself the checks would come. Someday. Once things settled. Once he trusted me to handle it myself again. "I haven't seen a statement on that account in 3 years," I said, and hearing myself say it out loud, in that voice, to a stranger who had once bled out in my arms, was its own kind of reckoning. He offered to manage it after I got out. I signed something in the hospital. I never went back and checked. Grant did not say anything triumphant. He did not say anything at all for a long moment. He just looked at me the way you look at someone you owe a debt to, when you realize the debt has gotten larger and more complicated than you understood when you first tried to pay it. "I'm not going to pretend I know what that money meant to you," he said finally, "but I know exactly what it's supposed to mean, legally. And I know what 18 months of structured transfers usually means when someone doesn't want them noticed. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the true answer, not the polite one you've probably given your family for years. Did you know? I could have told him a smaller version of the truth. I have told smaller versions of the truth to protect my father my entire life, out of habit, out of some stubborn hope that protecting him would eventually earn me something back. That hope had run out somewhere between the microphone and the terrace. "No," I said. "I trusted him with it because he's my father, and because correcting the story he told about me was always more exhausting than just letting him tell it. I let him manage that account the same way. I let him manage what our whole family believed about who I am. I think some part of me has known something was wrong for a long time, and didn't want to be the one who confirmed it. Notice that moment, because it is the one that changed everything that came after it. I did not storm back into that ballroom and demand a confrontation. I did not plan a single second of what happened next. I simply stopped protecting a lie I had been protecting for 7 years, the moment someone finally asked me the honest question directly. That is the only decision I actually made that night. Everything after it belonged to other people's choices, not mine. Grant made a call from the terrace, quiet and businesslike, the voice of a man who has run companies through worse nights than this one. Within 20 minutes, 2 members of his financial and legal team, already on site for the wedding's own logistics, were seated in a small library off the main hallway with laptops open, cross-referencing account numbers Colonel Whitfield had pulled from records he still had access to as an old friend and business associate of my father's firm. I did not go into that room. I want to be honest about that too. I sat outside on that terrace with my sleeping son and let people whose job it was to find the truth go find it, because I had spent 7 years being the only person willing to do the dangerous, patient work of uncovering things buried under the surface, and for one night, I let someone else kneel in that particular dirt. It took them 38 minutes to confirm what Grant had already suspected. $340,000. Moved out of a Department of Veterans Affairs, Disability Trust in 19 separate transfers over 18 months. Structured carefully enough to avoid a single reporting flag on their own. Until you laid all 19 side by side and saw the shape they made together. Every transfer had landed. Eventually, in an events and hospitality holding account my father's company used for exactly one thing that year. Funding a wedding designed to impress the very investors currently standing in that ballroom drinking champagne. I did not learn the number from a piece of paper handed to me like a trophy. I learned it because Colonel Whitfield walked out onto that terrace himself, sat down across from me, and told me plainly, the way you tell a fellow officer something that cannot be softened. Because softening it would only waste time we did not have. My father, when Grant and I found him 20 minutes later, in a quiet hallway away from the main party, had already sensed something in the air shifting against him. I watched him try 3 different versions of composure in the space of about 10 seconds. Warmth, then authority, then a kind of wounded confusion. The way you watch someone flip through outfits looking for one that still fits. Grant did not raise his voice. That surprised me given everything. He simply held up a single printed page, the kind of document that looks unremarkable until you understand exactly what it costs someone standing in front of you. 19 transfers, Grant said. $340,000 out of a combat veterans disability trust into an account that paid for tonight's flowers and this tent, and probably most of the open bar. I'd like you to explain that to me, Franklin, and I'd like you to understand that I'm not asking as your future son-in-law anymore. I'm asking as someone whose company just spent 3 weeks doing standard financial due diligence before merging assets with your family, the way we do with every partnership, and who is very glad we did. My father's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do in 34 years. It went, briefly, completely blank. The particular blankness of a man realizing the story he has told himself about his own justification is about to be said out loud, by someone else, in a voice he cannot talk over. It was a loan, he said finally, and even he did not sound convinced by it. Against future consideration, Harper was never going to need that money the way she thinks she was. She has a job. She has support. This family needed it more. For something that was going to secure all our futures. Hers included, once the partnership with your company closed. I let that sentence sit in the hallway between us for a long moment, because it deserved to sit there, unanswered, so that everyone standing in that hallway could hear exactly what it was. You didn't ask me, I said. You didn't tell me. You signed transfers out of a trust the government set up, because I bled for this country, so that you could pay for canapes at a party where you stood at a microphone and told 300 people I had nothing to show for my life. He did not have an answer for that. For the first time in my memory, my father did not have an answer for anything. For a moment he looked less like the man who had built an empire, and more like someone watching it end, and some small, unwilling part of me almost felt it. Us in that hallway a few minutes later, still in her wedding dress, having heard enough second-hand fragments from a cousin to come looking for the truth herself. I want to tell you something about my sister, that the version of this story you might expect would leave out. She was not part of it. She did not know. When Grant told her plainly what the last hour had uncovered, I watched her face go through something that looked less like embarrassment and more like grief. The specific grief of realizing that a wedding she had believed was built on love had partly been built on money taken from someone she had grown up 2 hallways away from and never really known. She did not defend our father. She looked at me instead, and she said, in a voice much smaller than the one she had used all day, that she was sorry, that she had never known any of it, not the trust, not the transfers. And honestly, not most of what my life had actually been. I did not have a neat response for that. Some doors do not close in one conversation. I told her I believed her, because I did, and that felt like enough for one hallway on one very long night. The rest of what happened moved faster than any of it should have been able to. Word travels through a room like that, the way heat travels through metal, fast, and mostly out of your control. 3 of my father's most significant investment partners, men who had flown in specifically for this wedding to discuss folding capital into his next development, left before the cake was cut, not with dramatic speeches, but with quiet, efficient exits, the kind wealthy men make when they have decided a relationship is now a liability rather than an asset. I did not watch them go. Someone told me about it later, the way you hear about weather in another city. Here is the ending, honestly, because a tidy one would be a lie, and I promised you the truth in order. My father was not arrested that night. There was no dramatic scene of handcuffs on a marble terrace. What happened instead was slower, and in its own way, harder for a man like him to survive. Within a week, at Grant's insistence and with the help of a lawyer I had not spoken to in 6 years, Sergeant Dana Okafor, who had served under me once and now spent her days fighting exactly this kind of case, for other veterans, filed to formally freeze what remained of the account structure and open a civil inquiry into fiduciary misconduct. The full $340,000 was eventually returned to the trust, with interest, under a court-supervised repayment agreement my father entered, rather than risk a criminal referral. His company lost the investment partnership Grant had been the last piece of. 2 of the other investors who left that night never came back either. I did not push for more than that. Dana asked me once whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges, and I sat with that question for a long time before I answered it. I decided, in the end, that I did not need my father in a courtroom to know what he had done, and I did not need the state to finish a reckoning I had already started simply by telling the truth once, out loud, to the right person. I wanted my money back and my name back, and I wanted to never again wonder what he did with either one while I was not looking. I got all 3. Diane called me once, about a month later, in a voice I had never heard her use, quiet instead of curated, and told me she was sorry for the bracelet, of all things, for putting something on my wrist that morning that she must have known, on some level, was designed to keep a scar hidden rather than seen. I do not think that phone call fixed anything between us. I do think it was the first true sentence she had ever said to me. My father has not called at all. I do not know some days whether I am waiting for him to. I try to be honest with you the way I have tried to be honest through all of this, and the honest answer is that I do not fully know yet, and I am allowed not to know yet. Vivian and I have started speaking again, carefully, the way you rebuild something that was never actually finished being built the first time. She came to see Miles 2 weeks ago, sat on my living room floor and let him show her every single one of his dinosaurs by name, and stayed for dinner, and did not once ask me to explain myself. That is a small thing. It did not feel small. Miles asked me, a few nights after we got home from California, why his grandfather had said what he said in front of everyone. I did not give him the complicated answer, the one about trusts and transfers and 34 years of a story I let stand, because correcting it always felt more exhausting than living inside it. I told him that sometimes people who love someone still get the story about them wrong, on purpose or by accident, and that it is always allowed to say the true version out loud, even if you have to wait a long time to say it. Even if you have to say it to a stranger before you can say it to the people who should have already known. He thought about that for a while, the particular serious silence 6-year-olds fall into when they are actually listening. And then he asked if I would teach him how to shine his own shoes someday, the way soldiers do. I told him I would, and I meant it, and it had nothing to do with anyone in that ballroom. Grant did one more thing I want to tell you about, because it is the part I carry the most. More than the applause. More than the coin. More than watching my father's face come apart in a hallway. He set up a scholarship fund, modest, specific, in the name of the unit I served with, for the children of combat veterans who need help paying for things the rest of the world assumes families like ours can simply afford. He named Miles as its first recipient. Not out of pity, he told me, but because a 6-year-old boy had learned entirely the wrong lesson about what his mother's life had been worth, on a night that should have taught him the opposite. And he wanted at least one true thing to come out of that room for my son to hold on to later. I still have the coin. It sits on my kitchen windowsill now, where Miles can reach it, where he asked me once what steady hand meant, and I told him, honestly, that it meant someone once trusted me not to shake when it mattered, and that I intended to keep earning that. Quietly, for the rest of my life, whether or not anyone in a ballroom was ever watching again. I do not need my father to say he was wrong. I have stopped needing that, and I want you to hear how hard-won that sentence is, because it took 34 years and one broken glass across a crowded room to get there. What I needed, it turned out, was simpler and harder to admit. I needed to stop being the one who protected a story that was never true just because the truth had always felt too heavy to hand to a room. If you have ever carried a truth like that, quietly, for longer than you should have, because saying it out loud felt like more trouble than it was worth, I want you to know something. The truth does not need you to announce it. It only needs you to stop lying for someone else when the room finally asks the right question. If this story reached something true in you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because it genuinely helps stories like mine find the people who need to hear them. And I would love to know, in the comments below, has the truth ever arrived in your life at a moment you never saw coming? From someone you least expected to be the one asking? Tell me about it. I read every single comment, and I promise you, you are far less alone in this than it feels sitting at your own version of Table 14.